Hello, class. We are back for another chapter of The Land of Stories. The Enchantress returns. So we are on to chapter 2. This chapter is called Lunch in the Library. Okay. The next day at school, Alex was still having a hard time digesting the conversation and the pizza from the night before. The news of her mother's new relationship was a heavy thing to process and did nothing to help the gloomy state she was already in. She felt like she was slowly losing control over everything in her life, and she hated it. Alex desperately needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't her mom or her brother, but an outside source who could hug her and tell her everything was going to be all right. She needed her grandmother. She would have given anything just to see her face again. However, since that was impossible at the moment, Alex settled on seeing a form of her grandmother instead. At lunch, she went to one of her favorite places in the world, the school library. "Hi, Alex," the librarian said as Alex passed her desk. "You'll be happy to know I just ordered a new set of encyclopedias." "Really?" Alex said. "That's wonderful." She smiled for the first time all day. It faded a second later after she realized new encyclopedias was the most exciting news she'd had in weeks. "Thank you for your enthusiasm," the librarian said. "Earlier today I told another student I was getting new encyclopedias. He asked me how long I'd be in the hospital. Can you believe that? Times are definitely changing." "They sure are," Alex said under her breath. Alex went to the very last aisle of books where the children's literature was kept. Students weren't allowed to check out these books, as they were mostly used as reference for the English classes. From the top shelf, Alex pulled down an old book that was several hundred pages thick. It was exactly where she had left it on her last visit to the library. A treasure of classic fairy tales was written across its brown cover. It wasn't much to look at and didn't have nearly as much majestic charm as her grandmother's Land of Stories book, but it had become Alex's favorite book to visit in the library. She looked around to make sure no one was watching her. Besides the librarian, who was busy at her computer, she had the library to herself. Alex opened the book and flipped through the pages. She skimmed through the illustrations of Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, of Rapunzel and Red Riding Hood, and of Goldilocks and Jack and the Beanstalk. Surprisingly, they were accurate depictions of the people she had met a year ago in the fairy tale world. Alex finally found Cinderella and came across a picture she wanted to see most, an illustration of the fairy godmother. Alex couldn't help but chuckle under her breath every time she saw it. The artist's version of the fairy godmother couldn't have been further from what her grandmother looked like. In this book, she was a tall and voluptuous woman with big lips, wings, long blonde hair, and a large golden crown. However inaccurate it was technically still her grandmother, and that was all Alex needed to see. "Hi, Grandma," Alex said quietly to the book. "You look great. I like your crown and your wings. It's funny how different you look in every book I read. Are they just dramatic interpretations, or has your style changed over the years?" The fairy godmother was just a young fairy living in the fairy tale world when she discovered there was another world. She was the first and only person in the history of both worlds capable of traveling between the two at will. She never understood why she was given such a gift, but magic had always had a mind of its own. The world was in a very dark place during her first visit. It was the beginning of the Middle Ages, and war and plague were everywhere she looked. The fairy godmother told stories of her world to the children she met to brighten their spirits. The tales gave them such hope and joy that she decided to make it her life's work to spread the history of her world in theirs. The fairy godmother eventually enlisted other fairies, including Mother Goose and members of the Fairy Council, to travel secretly with her to help spread the stories, hence the name Fairy Tales, giving a bit of magic to a world that had little of its own. Over time, the fairies recruited other people, such as the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, to help with keep their stories alive. The two dimensions operated on different time schedules. The fairy tale world moved at a much slower pace compared to the other world. The fairies tried to visit the other world as much as possible, But though only months would pass between visits in the fairy tale world, decades would have passed in the other world. It wasn't until Alex and Connor, the first children belonging to both worlds, were born that the dimensions began moving at the same pace. Alex and Connor were the links that held the two worlds together. And as Alex held the treasury of classic fairy tales in her hand, she could almost feel that power running through her veins. It was no wonder they had loved fairy tales their whole life. Alex wondered if her grandmother had devoted the last year solely to spreading fairy tales around the world, or had something bad happened in the fairy tale world. "Grandma, I don't know what's going on, but I could really use you right now," Alex said to the book. "Everything's changing. Everything is moving in directions I don't like. This whole growing up thing is a lot harder than I ever thought it would be, and not getting to see you makes it unbearable." Alex took another look around the library to make sure she was still alone. She hugged the book as tightly as she could without damaging it and whispered into the top of the spine. "Please let me come back to the land of stories," she said. "Let me join you and the other fairies. If something has happened, let me help you. I know I can. Please, just send me a sign. Let me know you're okay." Alex held the book for a few moments more, hoping that maybe today would be the day she would be magically transported back into the world she loved so much. But to her disappointment, she stayed put in the library. Her whispers didn't go entirely unnoticed, though. "If hugging that one doesn't work, try one of these," said the voice from nearby. Startled, Alex dropped the treasury. Down the aisle, seated on the floor with a few stacks of books piled around him, was Connor. Alex had completely missed him. "You scared me," Alex said. She was embarrassed, not knowing what he had and hadn't heard her saying to the inanimate object. "You're lucky I know. Otherwise, I probably would have reported you to the school psychologist," Connor said, with a mocking but loving smirk. "What are you doing here?" Alex asked him. She walked down the aisle closer to her brother and saw that the majority of books around him were also different storybooks and fairy tales. "Same as you, apparently," Connor said, and then snickered to himself, "although I didn't try to get to first base with any of them or anything." "Very funny," Alex said, and took a seat next to him. "Is this your first time ever being in a library?" Connor sighed and shrugged his shoulders. "I've been in a bit of a funk today. I thought if I came in here and flipped through a couple of these, I would feel better," he explained. "Did it work?" Alex asked. "For the most part, I'd say," Connor said. "Why do you think that is?" "Well," Alex said, straightening her headband, "I read in a zoology book once that certain species of birds and insects that live in trees will climb down and hide in the roots if they ever feel like their home is being threatened." Connor looked at her like she was speaking in tongues. "And how is that relevant to this topic?" "Because," Alex explained, "our home is being threatened. Things are changing. So here we are, in a library, reading old fairy tales. We return to our roots." "Sure," Connor said, only half understanding her comparison. "How can you remember that, but you can never remember the names of singers on the radio?" "My point is," Alex continued, "sometimes all we need to see are a few familiar faces to make us feel comfortable again." Connor nodded. "Well, I wouldn't say I saw any familiar faces," he said. He searched through his pile of books and pulled out a couple to show her. "In this, the Egyptian version of Cinderella, Grandma is a hawk," he told her excitedly. "And in this one, Grandma's not even in it. Cinderella gets her gown and shoes from a tree. Can you believe that? Like a tree could give her a new dress. Please, a complete stranger with a wand is much more believable." "We should write letters to complain," Alex said. "Should we sign it as the grandchildren of the fairy godmother? Do you think they'll take it more seriously if we do?" They both laughed. "Definitely," Connor said. "Or personal acquaintances of the long-lost charming prince. I bet no one has ever heard that one before." Both the twins went silent for a moment, and their amusement faded into despair. "I miss Froggy," Connor said. "I miss saying Froggy." "There's not much we can do about it," Alex said. "If Grandma wanted us to come back, she would tell us what was going on. Until then, I guess we'll have to keep hugging books." "Great," Connor said sarcastically. "I wonder what Dad would tell us if he were alive. I don't think there's a story even in his catalog that could help us get through everything we're going through now. Alex had to think about it. Most of her dad's stories had been perfect for their elementary school dilemmas, but what advice would he give them now? I bet he would say that anyone can have a once upon a time or a happily ever after, but it's the journey between that makes the stories worth telling. And how characters face the challenge at hand is what makes them heroes. Yeah, Connor said, something like that. You're good at this. A high-pitched beep sounded as an announcement was made over the loudspeaker. Connor Bailey, please report to the principal's office. Connor Bailey, please report to the principal's office. Both the twins looked up towards the speaker and then at each other. What did you do? Alex asked. I don't know, Connor said with a gulp. He mentally rewound through the past 4 weeks of his life, thinking of anything he had done that could warrant a trip to the principal's office, but found nothing. At least I don't think I did anything. Connor collected his things and put the library books back on the shelf. Well, wish me luck, he said to his sister. See you after school. I hope. Alex stayed seated on the floor. Discouraging thoughts filled her head. What would happen if she never saw her grandmother again? Would she become a weird, book-hugging lady who traveled from one library to the next? Would her future children believe her when she told them about her connections with the fairy tale world? The bell eventually rang and Alex got to her feet. She picked up the treasury of classic fairy tales from where she had dropped it on the floor and decided to take one last look at the illustration before heading to class. Alex turned to the same page she had been talking to before, and to her amazement, the illustration was completely different. Instead of the voluptuous woman with the wings and crown, the picture showed a petite woman with a kind smile in a sky blue sparkly robe. It was her grandmother. Alex looked around the library in shock as a smile grew on her face. Her grandmother had just sent her a postcard.